In this video, I'm going to outline the training I did leading up to some of my best ever climbing performances on the bike and give you all the detail into what I did, training wise, recovery wise, heat work wise, in this video. So, bit of context. So, this block started after the end of 2020 when COVID hit in New South Wales and we went into a lockdown. So, at the end of 2020, you can see here in my seasonal planner chart, this is my COVID maintenance period, so I knew that we weren't going to have any racing on for a long time. So you can see here all these weeks with decreasing training load. I was still riding; it wasn't completely off the bike, but it was really low, sort of 50% of normal training loads, and that my CTL dropped down to still a pretty decent level, but the lowest it got to here was 80, 81. So not too much of a drop off, but certainly not productive training. That ended in our team camp at the start of 2021. So in February, we had our team camp. And after our team camp, when we got together, I basically started training again and hit a very specific targeted block. So I'm going to show you the peaks I hit at the end of that block. Now, there were two NRS races I did, which is the National Road Series in Australia. I did the Melbourne to Warrnambool and the Grafton to Inverell. There was also meant to be one other race in there, which was Tour de Brisbane, which is the one I was targeting more, but that one got cancelled again because of COVID. So there was 3 NRS races in there. And the climbing PB that I actually did in this block, so it was actually a block from February till the start of May. You can see here all those, each of these columns is a week, and you can see a steady build going on over those 3 months. So I'm going to show you the peaks here. So I've go over to my dashboard here. We've got the NRS build I did those couple of months, all my peak powers for those months, and then I've brought up a reference series, which is my best ever. So the darker the green is the higher the percent. So you can see here in this sort of 4 to 15 minute area, there was a few PBs here. So peak 10 minute, this is watts per kilo, not raw power. So you can see here, for my 10 minute, I hit 100% of my which was my best ever. So 442 watts for 10 minutes, which was 6 watts per kilo, which has always been a pretty big goal for me to hit 6 watts per kilo, which is a bit of a heavier rider. Around 75 kilos is pretty hard to get. And then also a few other good PBs. So we're looking at 486 watts for 6 minutes, which was not far off my best ever, which was 504 watts, which I did when it was a bit heavier. And you can see some good maximal aerobic power 5 to 10 minute sort of duration PBs that I hit in there. And also I was getting some good sort of local crit results as well around this time. I'm going to show you what the weeks look like. We'll start sort of broader and then I'll bring it into individual sessions. So back here, we've got the breakdown of each week I did in this block. Now back to the calendar, this block was sort of this long, so it was 3 months here, and I'll show you the breakdown. So we're looking at each of these is a week. So we have the week breakdown. So basically, I work full-time, but my work is quite flexible, so I'm still able to train a decent amount, but nothing too crazy. So we're looking at the first week of this block, 19 hours, 650 kilometers, 894 T-score or TSS. Then we've got 14 and 3/4 hours, 475k, 720 T-score. And then we've got 18 hours. So we started off with a pretty big 3 weeks. Then we're looking at actually not massive weeks. So nearly 15 hours, 11 hours, big one here, 17 hours, 12 hours. Now, I got sick once in this block. I had a cold, which sort of knocked me around for half a week. So I think that might have been this week, where I only did 12 hours. Then we did 17 hours, 12 hours. The biggest week, which was 20 hours, which I think was the week I had Melbourne to Warrnambool. 12 hours, 13 hours. So, as you can see, nothing crazy. No, actually only 1 week that barely went over 20 hours. And I think the average, you're sort of looking at probably, if you average out all the weeks, probably around 15 hours of training. And then T-score as well. There was only 2 weeks that were above 1,000 TSS. The rest were all around the 800 or 900 mark. So nothing too crazy. What I'll also show you is that my training intensity distribution, so my time in zones. Now, I'm mostly showing you this because there's not really much to read into it here. I think I'll move myself out of here. A lot of a lot of coaches go a lot into training intensity distribution, but for someone like me who races a lot, I had a lot of local racing on it at the time, a lot of group rides, bunch rides incorporated as well. The training intensity distribution for me is kind of meaningless. I spent a good amount of time before this video looking into this to see if I could really see any take-home messages, and there's not much in it. I mean, there's probably a slight trend towards more time at VO2 max power and anaerobic power, which is this yellow and red section compared to the start. But yeah, basically what I'm kind of getting at here is my time in looking at just time in zones doesn't really reflect the changes I made in my training and how that progressed. So I'm actually just going to remove this one because it's not too many insights I can give from that side of things. So I'm going to show you firstly the ride I did where I would consider to be, you know, the peak of the form I reached and hit those PB numbers. So it was actually on a group ride here in Sydney, Kalutsi. It's the bunch leaves the city. We head out down south and then we do a chop off through the Royal National Park entire section. If I go into this to sort of show you the numbers I was hitting, 370 average for 33 minutes, normalized power 413 for 33 minutes at sort of my weight at this time was around 74 kilos. But the peak I did in here was actually up this first section, so this climb. So if I go into this bit here, you can see the first portion, I did 453 watts for 8.5 minutes. And then, you know, even this first part, which was pretty big, 468 for 6 minutes. A couple of other things to look at here in terms of, you know, just looking at the fitness that I achieved through this block. This climb in the middle, so after that effort, rolling some turns and then getting to this sort of 4-minute climb in the middle, so 460 watts for 4.5 minutes. Then crest the top, drop down to the descent, and then there's one final climb up to the finish. Then holding 467 watts, so 6.3 watts per kilo for 4 minutes at the end of that. So that was sort of, I consider, one of my best climbing, you know, form I've been. So I'm going to show you some of the sessions I did to get in that form. So got a couple of tabs open up the top here. So the first one was, I'll close this dashboard as well. So the first one, when I started off, one of the staples is just a straight endurance ride. So this is just 3 hours on my gravel bike. I choose to do this on the gravel bike because a lot of these roads I'm doing through here are sort of road, bike path, lots of corners. You can see sort of the power profile. I've done a lot of work to steady this out, but you can see here lots of sort of corners and turns and little stops. So I prefer to do this on the gravel bike. It just knocks a few, sort of like riding with an air hub, knocks a few K an hour off and allows me to stay on the pedals a bit better. But you know, this is one of the staples for the first 3 weeks I did was just endurance. So 226 average, normalized 232, so very close, and just real steady, just time in the endurance zone. So that's one of the keys that I used in the first 3 weeks. One of the other key sessions I did, especially at the beginning, but when I'm not really looking at building race-specific fitness or any fatigue resistance, purely looking at building my power, my engine, then as we got closer to those NRS races in a few months' time, doing more fatigue resistance and race-specific efforts. So this is another one, a standard 2x20 at threshold up at Akuna Bay in Sydney. So starting to hit sort of good powers in this, so 20 minutes at 392 watts. Again, no over-unders, no cadence changes. This is just what's the most amount of power I can put out in 2 sustained efforts. And that's what I really like to do in most of my training is repeated sessions and also keeping the sessions quite simple because I like to see progression week on week and I like to see that in my athletes as well. So standard 2x20, 392 watts, 398 watts, pretty standard sort of bread and butter workout for the first half of the build I did. Then the other one in terms of just building the engine, building the aerobic engine, trying to lift my threshold is bringing in some variation to the threshold work. So this one I did down in Canberra in Black Mountain. I really like these sets. So they're roughly 10-minute sets where I start off with 40 20s. So 40 seconds at or slightly above VO2 max power, 20 seconds off, and repeat that for 5 minutes. And then after that, going into a hold portion for 5 minutes, holding threshold power or slightly above threshold, sort of between 100 and 105%. So they're 10-minute sets. In this session, I did 3 of them. So we're looking at 413 average for 10 minutes, 424 normalized. And then, as you can see, I repeated this 3 times. And the final one here. So this is quite steady. Like the ability to do this, not, it's easy to do this on erg mode when the trainer's holding your power, but to do this on the road and hold the power steady is a skill which I've sort of developed by doing sessions over years, just repeat. So if you go out and sort of try and replicate this session, you might notice bigger spikes in your power at the start of these 40-second efforts, and more varied pacing, but you'll get better at it over time as you repeat the session. So that's another key session I use at the start of the build, just to build my engine and build my engine up. What I did as well is a specific heat prep in this with an at-home sauna. So there was 2 reasons for this. Now I'll show you where I did this. So this was the first week of this block. So week 2, and I started the heat sessions on week 3. You can see these little symbols with, little medical symbol is where I log on today's plan when I did a sauna session. So they were either on their own, sort of I might ride in the morning, hop in the sauna at night, or finish a ride and then literally get in the door and within a minute be in the sauna and sitting there for 30 minutes. So 2 reasons for doing this. You can either do it in the 3 or 4 weeks directly before a race that is going to be hot for heat acclimation, for a very specific heat prep, or really the reason I was doing this wasn't really because I was going to do races in the heat. I mean, Tour of Brisbane might have been a little bit warm, so I had that in the back of my mind. But really, I found that doing the heat protocol at the start of a training block, especially when the training intensity isn't too high, does help with adaptation. So stimulating red blood cell adaptations, increased plasma volume, and all those things that you get from doing heat training, I find really helps at the start of a training block to set you up well for bigger gains later in the block when the intensity comes up. And I found that worked really well here. So you can see here, basically this is a sauna. It's a sauna tent. I'll put up some photos of what that looks like. It's quite funny. So it's basically a tent you sit in. There's a little chair in it. It goes up to your neck. And then there's heating elements on the inside, and they get extremely hot. So you're sitting there and you basically just sweat it out for between 30 minutes is plenty, between sort of 30 and 40 minutes. Ideally directly after a session, when your core body temperature is already raised. Ideally come home, hop in. Or otherwise, if that's not possible, it does work on its own, sort of at another time of the day. But ideally, you're doing it post session. So I did this, as you can see. So I did it almost every day for this week. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in this week here, which was starting in the 3rd week of the build. I then did it 4 more times the next week, and then went into a maintenance. So that was 2 weeks, and then I went into a maintenance phase where I was doing it once a week, just to maintain those adaptations. Now you'd probably need a longer acclimatization period to get the benefits. Usually they recommend sort of 21 days of exposure. But I had from late last year, I'd already done a heat prep for the racing we had up in Tweed. So I'd already done a heat block there, so I kind of had some residual stimulus. So I found it only took me 2 weeks to get those benefits back. So that's another sort of thing that I added in the first half of this block, which I feel really paid off, because I didn't start hitting those peak, those all-time best climbing efforts until after I did this heat block. So that's, again, probably also one of the reasons why I was able to hold a lower training load, only sitting on, doing weeks 700 TSS, 750 TSS, 600 TSS. So being able to get away with slightly lower training load, but using other external stimulus to increase the aerobic adaptations I'm getting. The heat one is definitely something to keep in mind. So after that block where I hit these, I had some of these sessions where I was hitting really good climbing powers. Then we had some racing coming up. So we had some on this weekend here, which was sort of 6 weeks into the build. Had some state racing, and then we got into the NRS races. So I'm going to show you some of the fatigue resistance and more race specific sessions I did. I've got 3 examples up here. So the first one is some strength endurance work, then going into a race after that. I wouldn't recommend this for everyone because I do think even if it's a local race, it's best to approach it with a mentality of racing to win and not sort of rocking up and being like, I've come and done 2.5 hours, I've done some efforts and, using it as an excuse. But if you're training for bigger goals, you kind of need to do it. So this session here, what I do is I'll show you this section. So basically head over to the eastern suburbs of Sydney and I got this, that's climb that's about 3 or 4 minutes long. And then I do these strength endurance efforts at a lower cadence. So I'll click in and go into these. So we got 4 minutes at 347 watts at 53 RPM. Now for me, 347 watts at this time was sort of sweet spot in between tempo and threshold, probably around 90% of FTP. And did it at 53 RPM average. And I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 repeats. So 347 watts at 53 RPM. 322 watts at 41 RPM, so that one driving the cadence down a little bit more. And you can see 3 or 5 watts at 36 RPM, that's getting really low. A 4.5 minute effort at 36 RPM is very difficult. 320 watts at 41 RPM, and then we've got 330 watts at 44 RPM. So hovering between that tempo and sweet spot zone and getting the cadence down below 50 RPM, just as a way of just fatiguing myself, basically. Getting a fatigue level that I would be expecting 2 or 3 hours into a race, but being able to get that just with sort of 2 hours of riding, 2.5 hours riding time in the legs. So then just sort of endurance spinning it out, and you can see here like I'm nearly 3 hours into the ride, and then I'm starting a race. So this was a local criterium, flat one, and then just sort of looking at the power here. So starting the race 3 hours in, and then we're looking at the race 311 average, 346 normalized power. So normalized power around that sweet spot area. And then also, managed to do a pretty good sprint at the end of this. So hitting, what did I hit in this sprint at the end? Hitting over 1300 watts, and final sprint sort of 1100 watts for 13 seconds. Then at 4 hours into a ride with some strength endurance efforts. So that's, that was sort of a breakthrough session for me and a really good sign that things were tracking as they want. But, this sort of session isn't about increasing my capacity or increasing my raw power. This is now, I've already got that. I'd already achieved that in the weeks prior. This session is starting about making sure that I can do big power and big efforts at the end of a race. So as you get closer to a target event, you want your training to be more specific and more about, if you're doing longer road races, more about your fatigue resistance. So that's one session. Another session I also like to do was a similar idea where you're doing an effort before a race as a pre-fatigue and then going into a race. So this one, total ride time was sort of 4.5 hours. And what this one was an hour at sweet spot, normal nice high cadence, so 344 watts at 90 RPM for an hour. So that was pretty solid effort, pretty hard. Then spinning around at endurance, heading down to the local crit, and then doing our Tuesday night local race, where I've done 46k an hour for 40 minutes, and again 327 average, 353 normalized power. So big session here, and the only way this can be productive training, because people can do this for 1 or 2 weeks and the wheels will really start to fall off. So the only reason I can prescribe, I'm self-coached, so the only reason I can prescribe myself these sessions and know that I'm not just going to be digging myself a hole and that they're going to be productive is that my fueling is very good. I'm very strict with it. I'm hitting specific number of grams of carbs per hour. For these sessions, I'm usually aiming for 90 grams an hour. They usually end up, again, mostly being in my liquids, so in my bottle. So trying to hit 90 grams of carbs per hour, actually not trying to hit, I religiously hit that in these longer sessions. So sometimes even 100 grams per hour I'll do for pretty much every session. So the only way that this style of training is actually productive is if you're able to fuel and recover from it. So then the final one I'll show you on a similar vein of fatigue resistance and some race replication is another session I did here, this was one of the longest ones I did. Now, Melbourne to Warrnambool is about a 6.5 hour race. Grafton Inverell, again, sort of 6.5 hours. And I did hardly any rides over 5 hours because I just, I don't have I probably have the time. I'm just not that interested in doing rides that are that much longer over 5 hours. But so this is one of the harder ones and longer ones I did. So nearly 5.5 hours. And what I did here was go into Centennial Park in Sydney, and we have a bunch ride where the bunch chops off, rolls, turns for an hour. But I did a big pre-fatiguing effort before that. So I'll zoom into this section here. Now this is one of the more head-cracking rides, but you know, when you're in the mind where you're preparing for a race, you just sort of get it done. So 3 hours in Centennial Park, and each lap I would go around it at endurance power. So for me now, so you notice, if you remember that endurance ride I show you at the start, I think I averaged 230 watts. Now my endurance power sort of zone 2 sitting at sort of 260. So a big, you know, increase in my aerobic efficiency and my ability to sustain zone 2 power. So 266 watts for 3 hours, and then doing some strength endurance work as well. So every time I did a lap, I went up this climb here, this little sort of 1.5 minute climb, and I did that at low cadence. So I'll zoom in just to one little section. Computer's lagging a bit while this video records. And I'll zoom into this climb here. So going around the lap at endurance, and then every single lap for 3 hours, going up the hill at sort of sweet spot power output and low cadence. So 368 watts at 51 RPM, which is a minute and a half every lap. So I did that for 3 hours, and then we go into the drop off, which is always an hour long. And this, you know, again, a big breakthrough for me in this session. So 353 watts, average 370 normalized for an hour after 3 hours of doing, you know, those repeated sort of strength endurance efforts. This is the sort of race replication session that, you know, showed me I was on some good form. So a good one to do, but again, this is only possible if you're fueling adequately. I mean, these ones I'm rocking 2 1 litre bottles, mixed up really strong so I can hit that 100 grams of carbs an hour. Because as you can probably estimate, a session like this, 5 hours, 100 grams of carbs, it means I'm leaving the house with at least 500 grams of carbs either on me or in my bottles. So not easy to do, but it allows this style of training, which sort of got me in my best ever shape. So I hope this was useful. Just a bit of information on, just one of my many different training blocks. And this was one of my more successful ones. So I hope that was of interest to you guys.